Hi, Rich Fahle. I'm sitting right now with Matt Bai, and the book is All the Truth is Out, The Week Politics Went Tabloid. First, I just want to welcome you to PBS at the Miami Book Fair.
Rich. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, good to have you.
What a cool event, huh?
Oh, it is. I mean, everybody here at one time. And your book has made us all rethink, I think, what happened way back in 1987 with Gary Hart. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about, just first of all, how you came to the project in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a crazy and long journey for me. I wrote about Hart at the end of 2002 when I was a pretty new writer at the New York Times Magazine. He didn't like the story. I thought it was okay. We kind of went our separate ways, but it just kind of haunted me through the years. I felt like there was another level to it that I hadn't gotten to. I felt like it was related to the moment in which I was covering presidential politics as I went through a couple more campaigns. So I decided to go back at it, which, a lot of people thought was kind of nuts. But, one of the first things you realize, and part of why I went back to it, is how misremembered and wrong so much of what people think they remember from that time is. We all think the photo drove Hart out of the race, the famous photo, Donna Rice sitting on his lap.
Monkey business.
Monkey business, except it wasn't taken on monkey business. It was taken on a very crowded dock. It didn't surface till weeks after he was out of the race. We all think Hart said, challenge the press, follow me around, and then inexplicably went out and had this affair. It's not true. He said it to a single reporter in a moment of exasperation. It had not been published at the time the Miami Herald put him under surveillance. They had not read it at the time they decided to do that. And it was really a decision that he didn't make to redraw those boundaries, the decision we as an industry made. And so the more I got into things like that, the more I thought, hey, there's a story worth telling here, and I think people see it now.
There is, and it's a moment that Gary Hart has lived with for his entire life. And you get the sense of exasperation that he feels, and his wife, when you're talking to them, when you went back to visit with Gary Hart again. And he asks at one point in the book for perspective.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if he'll ever get it based on the fact that he was that crossover person. But what was your sense of how Gary Hart feels about everything that happened today?
Yeah, I mean, Rich, to me, that's at the core of the book, right? It's been discussed often in a sort of polemic way or an argumentative way, which is great because it gets people talking. But for people who read the book, the core of the book is narrative. It's this story, and he's at the center. He's a central character in a cast of really interesting people who are involved, reporters, Donna Rice, who I talked to. And part of what drew me to the story is not just thinking about the reverberations of this moment through the years of our politics and our journalism, but in the life of this man and his family, there's something so Shakespearean about it. He was caught in this moment, and in 1987, when Johnny Carson came out 3 nights running and made you the butt of his monologue, you got stuck in that moment like a bug trapped in amber, and he became stuck in that moment. And what he lived with, there's a chapter in the book called Exile, and what he lived with in those years after is so compelling to me because he just wanted to serve and could not. Interestingly, in the last couple weeks, he just assumed a new role. It's the first time he's had an official role in diplomacy for the country. He's now Secretary Kerrey's special envoy to Northern Ireland. He's been over there. He's getting great press over in Ireland for his sort of humility and his thoughtfulness about the process. And that's great to see. 77 years old, and he's just now, I think, getting a rebirth, and hopefully through the book and the discussion around it, being reevaluated for his legacy here too.
Which is something you said that is all he really wanted. It was to be useful again and to be a part of the process and to be able to take everything that he knows and be able to apply it.
Yeah, not to be president. I think he gave up on the presidency relatively easily, although I think it certainly haunts him what he feels he could have done. But just to be of value, to serve. His life's work was public service. And he became, in a way, emblematic of something we do in our politics and have done since that moment, which is, as Bob Kerrey, the former senator, puts it in the book, which is to make people the worst things they've ever done. To define them all in a moment instead of looking at the context of their full lives and their public careers. Yeah. And I think it's an injustice, not just to him, but to all the people that we do that to in the course of practicing this kind of predatory journalism.
Well, you said it was, it is sort of unfair for that person who is in the moment when the rules change. So before that, you had President Kennedy and others, and everybody. You write about Ben Bradlee and others who knowingly looked the other way, or Johnny Apple, and some of the things that happened back in that sort of golden era of, as it's considered, of journalism, when in fact they didn't report on that sort of thing. And yet the rules changed right at him, and so you think you're just going to be able to sort of walk through that gate, and I think that's the way Gary Hart responded, by even asking reporters to follow him. Assuming that he was still living under old rules, but in fact that's where the unfairness struck me, is that it changed with him.
That's right.
Even though he had done something that isn't great.
And that really is the significant hinge in reevaluating the story, I think, is that we always told ourselves, believed that Hart was foolish, and he issued this challenge, but he had done this foolish thing, and in doing so, he kind of invited all of us into his bedroom and into the bedrooms of other politicians, and he redrew all these boundaries. The truth is there were all these things going on in the culture having to do with the advent of a new generation of journalists who'd been weaned on Watergate and had certain career ambitions around it and certain feelings about the immorality of politicians and changing attitudes about adultery on the left and moral values on the right, and the advent of the satellite dish, which was brand new. All of these things churning in the culture. Someone was going to walk into it. Had it not been Hart, it surely would have been Bill Clinton or someone else. Mm-hmm. But he is the guy caught in that moment, and he is clueless about that turn in the culture. It's the only corner he really can't see around because he's a pretty visionary politician. And so he does end up on this wrong side of history. And I think that's a much more accurate way to look at it than something that he did himself. I think he walks into this churning vortex of forces in the culture.
You talk about, too, to go back to Ben Bradlee for a minute, there's an interview after he retired with David Frost that was really interesting to me in that it was where he acknowledged the rule change to some degree, and the way that he, as a reporter or as the person who would run the newspaper, would make decisions based on how other media is responding to this. Maybe you can explain that.
Yeah, well, Bradlee, who's an interesting, who just died, of course, an American hero, but an interesting figure in the subtext of the book because he is there with Kennedy in the early 60s, playing by the old rules. He's there, the hero of Watergate, where journalism really takes a turn toward a different kind of accountability. And then he's there, he plays a pivotal role at this moment with Hart, where that accountability goes into a whole other realm of integrity. And he does this interview with Frost just after he retires from the Post, and it's really lost. It's very hard to find. I had to go to the Library of Congress and get a fuzzy tape, that you put in this big machine. That's cool. But it was pretty wild. But he says, Bradlee really pushes him on this. Well, because rather Frost does. Frost says to Bradlee, who did you think you wronged in your time at the Post? And Bradlee immediately goes to Hart, but he doesn't admit it. He says, well, Gary Hart thinks we did, but I don't think we did. And Frost really sees something there and bores in on him and compares it to Kennedy, and why was the crime for Hart getting caught when Kennedy just gets away with it because he didn't get caught? And Bradlee says, yeah, I guess that's right. And he ultimately comes out with this statement, which I think is very fascinating. He says, look, we don't control this anymore. We choose not to write about it now, and then some little paper does it, and then the wire service does it, and then there's a story about why we got on our high horse and we refused to do it. He said, we just don't control it. And I think in that moment he comes as close to articulating the shift in the media at that moment in 1987 than anybody else involved really did, and basically throwing up his hands and saying, this is a current, and it's just carrying all of us downstream. And part of what I'm getting at in the book is trying to reevaluate that and saying, we might make the decision to go into people's personal lives or to go into scandals. We might make decisions that some things are essential to the morality of a candidate. We should, and in Kennedy's case probably should have. But we have to exercise judgment. We're not just carried by a current. We actually have decisions to make, and that's really my, part of my underlying point.
I like the point. It's an interesting point, but can you put the genie back in the bottle now that it's out? When you have such a broad variety of media in the mix now, how can you, if at all, put that back in the bottle?
Oh, I think you can. Look, I don't think you can ever go back to the way it was before, and I don't think we should. The good old days weren't always good. I said in Kennedy's case, I'm sure in other cases, we should have known. How did Richard Nixon? I mean, we're just going to talk about morality, not sex here for a moment, but how does Richard Nixon's 20 years of public life, 20 years at the top of public life before Watergate, nobody knows that he's essentially dishonest, paranoid, right? I mean, this is... We have evidence that wasn't always the best way to go. But I think we have a younger generation of journalists now who respond to this idea that it's not one size fits all, that every situation is different, that we bring judgment to it. And I think we also have a much more varied media, so that just because if you don't want to cover a story, well, fine, somebody else will, sure. But we all go off in different directions now. It's not the three networks, and if two of them are doing it, the other one looks idiotic. It's a much more varied media landscape. So I think we can bring nuance to it that we didn't before. And I think my generation and younger in journalism know that something's wrong and want to bring more context to reporting.
Excellent. Well, the book is All the Truth Is Out. The week Politics Went Tabloid. It's fascinating subject matter for anybody who cares about history and politics, certainly. Matt Bai is our guest. Thank you so much.
Rich, thank you. Glad to be here.
Really interesting.